Let me extend my greetings to the Lviv Forum and say that I'm sorry I can't be there with you. You're meeting at an important time for Ukraine. President Zelensky will meet on Monday with President Putin, German Chancellor Merkel, and French President Macron in an effort to see whether the conflict in Donbass, a conflict that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine, can be brought to an end and a settlement be reached that would restore Ukrainian sovereignty. I've been asked to talk about what risks there might be from Ukraine's Western partners as Ukraine proceeds down this process of exploring whether peace is possible. But let me say at the outset that it seems to me sensible and important that Kyiv now test Moscow's readiness for peace. The conflict in Donbass has now gone on for more than 5 years at enormous cost, including more than 14,000 people killed. And it's important to see whether this conflict can be brought to an end. Now, thus far, it appears that the Kremlin has preferred to keep the conflict in Donbass going, believing that a simmering conflict there can be used to put pressure on Kyiv and make it more difficult for Ukrainians to move on with the important reforms that will help make Ukraine build a modern and successful European state. But it still makes sense to test and see whether there's any readiness in the Kremlin for peace. So let me talk about a couple of the risks. One obvious one, which I heard about when I was in Kyiv 5 weeks ago, was concern on the part of Ukrainians that just as Ukraine is moving to explore a possible settlement on Donbass, in the United States, Ukraine's important partner in the West, you have a situation where Americans are focused on the question of impeachment. And that stems from President Donald Trump's bid to extort President Zelensky and to try to get President Zelensky to investigate President Trump's potential political rival in 2020. And that does, or at least when I was in Kyiv, what I heard was this concern that somehow this could undermine American support for Ukraine. I believe American support for Ukraine is and will remain strong. It's strong, and it's strong on the part of Congress, where Ukraine enjoys bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans alike. And among those officials of the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the National Security, those officials who shape American policy on a day-to-day basis, they understand that Ukraine and Ukraine's success is important for American national security interests. Now, a second concern will be, as Ukraine enters this process, the Normandy process, will the Germans and the French be putting pressure on Ukraine to reach a settlement? To be sure, Europeans would like to see the conflict in Donbass ended, and there may be some pressure, but I don't think that the Germans and the French are going to be pushing President Zelensky to accept unwise or to make unwise concessions. Now, there are a couple of important points. I know that in some quarters of Ukraine, the Minsk agreements are not popular. But I would argue that the Minsk agreements are important for a couple of reasons. First of all, they keep the Germans and the French engaged, and I would argue that that has been useful for Ukraine over the last 5 years. And second, the Minsk agreements are the basis for European Union sanctions on Russia, which can be a major factor in altering the Kremlin's cost-benefit analysis and hopefully getting the Kremlin to change its policy. So I would argue that it would be unwise to throw over Minsk unless and until there's something in place to replace it. A second point is that you're working through the Minsk issues. Some of those questions will be controversial, but it will be important and useful for Ukraine to work on those questions in order to see if peace is possible. And when doing this, it seems to me that Chancellor Merkel is going to be an important partner for Ukraine. She understands President Putin. She understands that he's a challenge for the West and a threat to Ukraine. She also supports Ukraine's restoration of sovereignty over Donbass, and I believe at the end of the day that while she wants to see an agreement come out, she's not going to be pushing President Zelensky to be making bad decisions, to be making unwise concessions. So yes, there are some risks and there are some challenges in this process, but at the end of the day, I think it makes sense for Kyiv to explore and see whether Russia is prepared to bring this conflict in Donbass to an end and reach a genuine settlement that allows Ukraine to restore sovereignty over all of Donbass. Thanks again for listening to this message, and I wish you a successful conference.